February 19th, 1954. In front of 12,000 spectators inside Tokyo's legendary Kokugikan Arena, history was made, and legends were born. In the middle of the arena, 4 fighters were getting ready to duke it out in the ring. On one side, 2 professional wrestlers from Canada called the Sharp Brothers, both standing at a massive 6.5 feet tall, weighing in at 240 and 250 pounds respectively, and undefeated as World Tag Team Champions for 5 years. The Sharp Brothers were bona fide megastars of the pro wrestling world. On the other side, 2 Japanese men, 5'9" and 5'7", 243 and 185 pounds respectively. Now, these 2 Japanese fighters were no slouches either. The shorter one of the two, Kimura Masahiko, would go on to become one of the greatest judoka in history, and his partner was a talented ex-sumo wrestler turned pro wrestler with a good amount of hype behind him, a man who went by the name Rikidōzan. Tickets for the fight were sold out well in advance, newspapers were filled with articles about the event, and 2 newly established Japanese TV stations, NHK and Nippon Terebi, secured the rights to broadcast the fight throughout the whole country. Talent aside, few actually expected the Japanese to get a good result against these 2 massive Canadians that came to visit the land of the rising sun. Following a crushing defeat in World War II not even a decade earlier, and the subsequent occupation by the Americans, both morale and confidence were at an all-time low among the Japanese. And yet, a certain sense of hope was in the air. What if, miraculously, the 2 Japanese wrestlers could compete with, or even defeat, the towering Westerners? The possibility alone was enough for an estimated 10 to 14 million people to tune into the live television broadcast. Both at home and in front of TVs set up by Nippon Terebi in some of Japan's busiest public squares. At the west exit of Tokyo's Shinbashi station, for example, 20,000 hopeful spectators gathered in front of a tiny 27-inch television, and similar stories started developing across countless public spaces across the nation, with people climbing trees, rocks, and lampposts just to witness a potential miracle. And they were not disappointed.
美しい猛烈な美しい2回目あと3回目よいしょ決まりましたまさに激突する肉弾です力道山大奮戦です
Rikidōzan especially left a lasting impression, going toe-to-toe with the Sharp Brothers and delivering blow after blow on the Sharp Brothers. After several minutes of ecstasy and roaring cheers from the crowd, the fight ended in a draw. Rikidōzan and Kimura Masahiko didn't win against the foreigners, but it certainly felt like they did. To quote Matsutaro Shoriki, the owner of Nippon Terebi, Rikidōzan, by his pro wrestling in which he sent the big white men flying, has restored pride to the Japanese and given them new courage. Within a few years after that fateful night in early 1954, Rikidōzan became the most recognizable name in the country, the owner of a vast business empire, and Japan's first post-war national hero, all while actually not being Japanese. And despite seemingly having such a bright future ahead of him, the man lived a life that was short, but also eventful. A life that was just as intertwined with fame and the pro wrestling scene as it was riddled with crime, violence, and controversies. Today, let's explore how Rikidōzan became so beloved, how he got involved with Japan's highest-ranking Yakuza leaders, and how his life abruptly and tragically ended at the hands of the Yakuza. If you end up enjoying this video, make sure to tell the algorithm. Leave a like and subscribe if you don't want to miss out on any future Japanese crime and history content. Also, check out the link below if you want to support me on Patreon for as little as $1 per month. But for now, we have a story to tell. This is the story of Rikidōzan, a Japanese national hero with a secret past. As I mentioned just a minute ago, Rikidōzan, the biggest hero of Japan's post-war era, was not born as a Japanese. And so his story obviously starts off in another country. Or kind of, I guess. Rikidōzan was born in 1924 under the name Kim Sin-Rak as the son of a poor working-class family from southern Hamgyong province in what is now North Korea. Back then, of course, the whole Korean peninsula was occupied by Japan. So yeah, I guess technically he was born in Japan, but not really. He didn't find his way to the Japanese islands until he discovered a sport that tends to attract many boys from Japanese lower-class families: sumo wrestling. The young Kim Sin-Rak, while tending to his dying father, spent a lot of time participating in a sport called shirun, a style of Korean wrestling that is not dissimilar to sumo. His talents were soon spotted by Momota Minosuke, a Japanese man who moved to Korea in order to pursue a career as a policeman. Momota was also a big admirer of Japan's national sport of sumo wrestling and had close ties to Tokyo's Nishinoseki sumo stable, often acting as a sort of scout on their behalf. And his eye for talent told him that this young boy from North Korea just had to try his hand at sumo wrestling. Kim Sin-Rak was quick to agree, but his mother wasn't, as the father of the family really needed someone to take care of him. It wasn't until the death of his father in 1939 that the now 15-year-old Kim Sin-Rak, still against the wishes of his mother, traveled to Japan to join Nishiноseki's stable and begin his training as a sumo wrestler. He had his sumo debut the following year, and at first his Korean origins and his actual name were listed on the ranking sheets. However, the amount of discrimination that Koreans tend to receive in Japan had both Kim Sin-Rak and his mentor Momota Minosuke worried that actually competing as a Korean might hurt his career in the long run. Life in sumo is tough as is, but as a foreigner in the 1940s, these days, with Mongolian wrestlers having dominated the sport for around 20 years, sumo has pretty much no choice but to welcome worthy foreigners into the sport. But for most of sumo's long and storied history, the idea of a non-Japanese competing with, or even beating a Japanese wrestler at their beloved, divine sport was completely unacceptable. And so, Kim Sin-Rak, the boy from North Korea, became Momota Mitsuhiro, the pure-blooded Japanese son of Momota Minosuke. He was born not in Hamgyong province, but in Omura, Japan, where he enjoyed quite a successful athletic career in Omura High School before deciding to become a sumo wrestler. With a detailed, fabricated story all set up, he also received his ring name that he would be known by for the rest of his life: Rikidōzan. When it came to his talent for sumo wrestling though, Rikidōzan had nothing to hide. Despite being ridiculed for his nationality by those inside the stable who knew about his origins, he persevered and rose up the ranks of sumo at an unstoppable pace. By May of 1949, he had reached the rank of Sekiwake, sumo's third highest rank, and was allegedly about to be promoted to Ozeki, the second highest rank. But then, in September of 1950, Rikidōzan suddenly retired from the sport. Officially, he stepped away from sumo due to a lung infection, but the true reasons behind his retirement are a bit less straightforward. Discrimination, despite his best efforts to hide his true identity, surely played a big role in his decision. But there were also reports about a heated fight between Rikidōzan and his stablemaster Tamanoumi. Rikidōzan was seemingly unhappy with his low pay, and after being denied a higher payout, he cut off his chonmage, or top knot, which is usually only done during a sumo wrestler's retirement ceremony. Rikidōzan was officially done with sumo, and with that, he had to look towards new sources of income, which first led him to the Japanese black markets, and later to a man named Nita Shinsaku. Nita got himself into a favorable position during his time working in a Japanese POW camp, secretly supplying American inmates with valuable goods like food and cigarettes. Some of those Americans went on to take up important leadership positions inside the American occupation government of post-war Japan, and both Nita and his construction business profited greatly from his previous acts of kindness, receiving preferential treatment by the Americans when it came to handing out new contracts. Some of his newly found wealth, he decided to invest into sumo, financially supporting not only Rikidōzan, but the whole Nishinoseki stable. On the side, he also had ties to Japan's thriving criminal underworld, something that, to be fair, wasn't all that uncommon among those who made their money in construction. Spoiler alert, Nita was the first, but certainly not the last Yakuza affiliate that Rikidōzan got involved with. To pay the bills, Rikidōzan started working as a construction supervisor while also studying English in his spare time and discovering the nightlife of Tokyo's popular Ginza district for the first time. As for his career in construction, it wouldn't last that long. In 1951, he caught wind of a handful of Americans who wanted to promote the sport of pro wrestling in Japan by setting up a charity pro wrestling tour which included, among others, the Olympic weightlifter Harold Sakata, who later gained international fame, not only as a professional wrestler, but also as the guy who portrayed Oddjob in the 1964 James Bond movie Goldfinger. You know, the guy who can literally decapitate you with his bowler hat.
Remarkable. But what does the club secretary have to say?
Legend has it that it was actually Sakata who convinced Rikidōzan to join the tour, after a brawl inside a Ginza cabaret, of course. But despite the two definitely training together later on, this version of the story seems to be somewhat disputed. It seems more likely that American wrestler Bobby Bruns, who had been in Japan prior to the start of the tour, invited Rikidōzan to join them. Either way, Rikidōzan started his training, and a month later, on October 28, 1951, made his professional wrestling debut at the legendary Ryogoku Kokugikan. He managed to hold his opponent, the aforementioned Bobby Bruns, to a draw, marking a pretty successful start to his career as a pro wrestler, and his success continued the following year. In 1952, he made his way to the US to train and wrestle all over the country, finishing over 260 different fights over the span of 13 months, only losing to 3 different wrestlers in total. Pretty impressive stuff, especially for a newcomer. In order to even go to the US though, Rikidōzan had to become a Japanese citizen. Due to the ongoing Korean War, he was now a citizen of communist North Korea, a fact that would be almost guaranteed to bar him from entering the US. And so, before leaving for his 13-month tour of the US, Rikidōzan turned his fabricated story into reality. The Momotas from Nagasaki were officially recognized as his parents, his name was legally changed to Momota Mitsuhiro, and Omura became his official birthplace. On paper, Sin-Rak, or Momota Mitsuhiro, or Rikidōzan, was now 100% Japanese. The story of how he had to keep his past a secret from the public, however, was far from over. At least for now though, his future was looking bright. With a couple of impressive victories under his belt and a good amount of hype surrounding him, Rikidōzan returned to Japan in 1953, and in July of that year, officially established Japan's first full-time pro wrestling organization, the JWA, or Japan Pro Wrestling Alliance. To do that, he needed vast amounts of funds, and even though he saved up most of the cash that he earned during his US tour, he needed the support of some influential people in the industry to get the ball rolling. Nagata Sadao, one of the most well-known promoters in Japan at the time, decided to give Rikidōzan and his new venture a shot, and so did Nippon Terebi president Matsutaro Shoriki, who agreed to broadcast the whole thing. Rikidōzan's old friend, financial patron, and Yakuza affiliate Nita Shinsaku was also on board to provide additional funds to the project. There had been attempts to bring Western-style wrestling to Japan before this, but with more passion, expertise, and of course money behind it than anything else that came before it, the JWA was the first serious attempt at bringing the sport to the land of the rising sun. Puroresu, as the Japanese like to call it, was born. The first cards promoted by the JWA took place a mere 7 months after the founding of the organization, resulting in a 3-day wrestling event that started on February 19th, 1954. The first day of the event, of course, featured the historic fight between Rikidōzan and Kimura Masahiko against the Canadian Sharp brothers, then tag team champions of the world. Media coverage ahead of this event was massive, but not necessarily because the Japanese were excited to see Western-style wrestling on a big stage for the first time. Rather, the mere fact that athletes of this magnitude came to visit the impoverished, defeated nation of Japan was reason enough to hype the JWA's first event up beyond belief. The idea of inviting the Sharp brothers was that of Rikidōzan himself. During his US tour, he noticed that he was enthusiastically cheered on by an audience which consisted almost entirely of Japanese Americans whose life in the US had been a living hell during the war. Rikidōzan, who they at least thought to be Japanese, was their hero, which inspired him to not only keep up the charade of hiding his true identity, but he also discovered that what worked on the Japanese living in the US must work just as well for those who live in Japan. Get a Westerner, kick his ass in the ring, and rake in the cash. A simple concept that ended up working like a charm. And speaking of raking in the cash, that's exactly what his tag team fight against the Sharp brothers ended up doing. The event, however, didn't just line the pockets of Rikidōzan and his organization, but also those of the TV stations and TV manufacturers. JWA's 1954 event was considered to be somewhat of a watershed moment in Japan's early television history. The tag team fight against the Sharp brothers was watched by an estimated 10 to 14 million people. The next day, an estimated 24 million viewers tuned in, with countless Japanese citizens buying a brand new TV set just to watch Rikidōzan emerge victorious over Ben Sharp that night. Obviously, the fights were staged. The Sharp brothers were paid huge sums of cash to not only come to Japan, but also to lean into the villain role, getting in a few cheap fouls and illegal blows here and there to really rile up the audience. But viewers could be divided into two different groups: those who didn't know, and those who did know, but chose to ignore it because the spectacle and the energy of it all was just too exciting to ignore. After years of low morale, the Japanese finally had a hero to cheer for once again. And that hero was Rikidōzan. His face was plastered seemingly everywhere, on television programs, in magazines. He even managed to snag up a few movie roles as well, appearing in a total of 29 films between 1953 and 1959. Riki Mania had truly set in, and more spectacular wrestling events were soon to follow as well, including a somewhat controversial match between Rikidōzan and his former tag team partner Kimura Masahiko in December of 1954. Allegedly, Kimura asked Rikidōzan to fight for a draw, but Japan's national hero had different plans. What was supposed to be a show turned into an actual fight between the two, and ended with Kimura laying on the mat bleeding as the referee counted to 10.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 3 アウト。1本目はカウンテッドアウト15分29秒でRikidōzanの勝ちであります。
There was also a bit of controversy regarding the first 6 minutes of footage of the fight, which had been lost over the following years. Some claimed that they were lost on purpose because Kimura was dominating the first few minutes. Others claimed that they were simply not shown because the fight up until then had been incredibly dull. Either way, Kimura lost a lot of his wrestling prestige that night, while Rikidōzan went on to become more and more popular and successful. So much so that after defeating Yamaguchi Toshio in Osaka a month later, he claimed that he was done fighting Japanese wrestlers, and from now on would only consider international wrestlers as worthy competition. On October 7th, 1957, he got exactly what he asked for. He managed to get Lou Thesz, one of the greatest American wrestlers of his era, to come to Tokyo and compete against him in front of 27,000 spectators at Tokyo's Korakuen Stadium, the city's biggest baseball stadium until the Tokyo Dome was constructed. This fight, which ended in a draw, would be one of the biggest highlights of Rikidōzan's career, and one of the most viewed television broadcasts in Japanese history, with a Nielsen rating of 87, a record that will only be broken by Crown Prince Akihito's wedding in 1959. Rikidōzan was at the peak of his popularity, the most recognizable face in Japan, but it was also around this time that Rikidōzan started showing the uglier side of his personality. He had long since been known to be a heavy drinker, a regular of Ginza's nightclubs and cabarets who resorted to violence when dealing with anyone who got in his way, from members of the Yakuza to regular old taxi drivers. Rikidōzan associated himself with some very dangerous people and got into unnecessary fistfights on a regular basis, but the public for the most part was as blissfully unaware of their hero's bad attitude, alcoholism, and anger management issues as it was of his true origins and identity. Rikidōzan, though, had enough friends in high places and dangerous circles to make sure that lips would stay sealed, and his list of friends included some heavy names. In June of 1956, his old friend and business partner Nita Shinsaku passed away, leaving the JWA with a huge gap in terms of investment. To fill this gap, Rikidōzan turned to a man that made the Yakuza-affiliated Nita look like a Boy Scout. Kodama Yoshio, the infamous Japanese ultranationalist and war criminal who was involved in everything that Japan had to offer between the 1950s and the 1980s, was hired as the organization's chairman, while Ono Bamboku, a high-ranking right-wing politician so entangled with the Yakuza that he could almost pass as a member himself, became the JWA's commissioner. and to add just a bit more shadiness to his organization, he made both Taoka Kazuo and Machi Hisayuki a part of the team as well. For those who regularly watch my channel, Taoka Kazuo, the boss of Japan's biggest gang ever, may not need an introduction. But he was important to Rikidōzan for one reason in particular. He was the owner of the Kobe Entertainment Company, one of the biggest talent agencies in the country. As for Machi Hisayuki, he was a man with immense amounts of wealth, but was also the dominant force in Rikidōzan's beloved Ginza district and a fellow Sainichi Korean. The organization's plan from then on was as follows. JWA events that were held west of the city of Hamamatsu were under the influence of Taoka Kazuo and his Yamaguchi-gumi gang. Events held in the Kanto region belonged to Machi Hisayuki and the Tozeikai, and any event that took place north of Japan's Tohoku region was handled by one of Kodama Yoshio's allies. Let's just take a step back for a minute and take a look at this whole situation. Japan's very first pro wrestling association was now controlled by a Japanese ultranationalist and war criminal, the country's most dangerous Yakuza boss, a filthy rich Korean Yakuza boss, and a North Korean pro wrestler who served as a symbol of Japanese power and resilience. Wild stuff. At the same time, Rikidōzan was getting ready to launch a whole business empire, which went way beyond just pro wrestling. He operated hotels, nightclubs, one of Japan's first bowling alleys, and a 7-story wrestling venue in Shibuya called Riki Sports Palace. The man was clearly ambitious. Maybe too ambitious. A Western-style apartment complex in Tokyo's Akasaka district called Riki Apartments was reportedly only part of a much bigger plan to turn the whole Akasaka district into his own Riki Kingdom. That plan, as you can imagine, ultimately failed. Generally, as impressive as all of these different business ventures might have seemed, in reality, they all pretty much failed to turn a profit. Rikidōzan was soon knee-deep in debt and lending money from shady quote-unquote friends from the Japanese underworld. You know, not exactly the kind of people you want to be owing money to. The only business that never failed Rikidōzan was wrestling. He still had a huge contract with Mitsubishi for a weekly wrestling television program and was still able to attract massive crowds both to stadiums as well as television sets across Japan. Some of the most prestigious fights of Rikidōzan's late wrestling career included a match against classy Freddie Blassie in 1962 and, more importantly, a 1963 meeting with the Destroyer, Dick Bayer, who would go on to become a legend of the Japanese pro wrestling scene in his own right.
What are you telling me? Why don't you tell to this guy right here too? I know the rules!
Rikidōzan vs. the Destroyer, with a Nielsen rating of 62, became one of 2 Rikidōzan matches that are still included among the top 10 most watched Japanese television broadcasts of all time. Japan's favorite wrestler still had it in terms of entertaining his massive fan base and making them sit down inside of a stadium or in front of a TV screen. On the surface, Rikidōzan seemed invincible. When he was in the ring, in front of a large crowd, or on television sets across the country, he looked like the hero that the people of Japan knew and loved. Thus, what happened on the night of December 8, 1963 might have come as a huge shock to those who only knew Rikidōzan's public persona. On that fateful night, Rikidōzan chose to spend the night at the New Latin Quarter, a fancy nightclub located in the basement of the newly constructed Hotel New Japan, where the rich and the famous rubbed shoulders with members of the KGB, the CIA, the MI6, and the Yakuza. Rikidōzan, drunk out of his mind, was being his usual, intolerable self away from the cameras, chucking coasters and racial slurs at an African-American band that was playing that night. Once the music stopped playing, both Riki, accompanied by a hostess, as well as a young, low-ranking member of a local Yakuza gang, made their way to the club's restroom area. The 24-year-old Murata Katsushi was a member of the Sumiyoshi Ika, an affiliate gang of the much bigger Sumiyoshi Kai crime syndicate, one of the biggest of its kind in the country and a fierce rival of the Tozeikai, the gang of Rikidōzan's good friend and fellow Korean Machi Hisayuki. As Murata approached the bathroom, he spotted Rikidōzan standing in the doorway together with the hostess, tried to squeeze his way through, and accidentally made physical contact with Japan's favorite wrestler. Rikidōzan claimed that the young Yakuza member had stepped on his shoe and demanded an apology. But Murata wouldn't have it, and after a heated exchange of words, Rikidōzan sent him flying with the right hook onto the bathroom floor, jumped on him, and kept punching him in the face. Murata, with seemingly no other option left, grabbed his 6-inch hunting knife, stabbed Rikidōzan in the stomach, and made a run for it. after allegedly taking to the stage and warning the other guests to be careful and go home because, quote, there is a killer in this club. Rikidōzan also left the scene and quickly made his way to Sano Hospital to treat his wound, which was deemed by the doctors to be non-lethal, despite requiring an immediate surgery. Rikidōzan should have gotten away from this encounter almost unscathed. But on December 15, 1963, a week after the stabbing took place, Rikidōzan passed away in a hospital under somewhat mysterious circumstances. I've read a few different theories as to how exactly Rikidōzan ultimately met his demise. Some say it was due to his own negligence, eating and drinking alcohol against the doctor's orders, leading to an inflammation that ultimately killed him. Others say that it was actually the fault of the doctors, who had miscalculated the amount of anesthetic. A few journalists came up with more insane theories regarding the stabbing itself, saying that the murder of Rikidōzan was actually a plot by the CIA, who considered the wrestler to be a sympathizer of North Korea's communist regime, who was ready to defect at any moment. Journalists also cited the date and location of the stabbing as being more than sheer coincidence. Rikidōzan was, after all, stabbed inside a known CIA hangout spot on the 22nd anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor. According to Japan's Standard Time, at least. Now, while it is true that the CIA was heavily involved in Japanese politics back then, doing everything they could to keep communism as far away from Japan as possible, this theory doesn't have much to it if you ask me. There were no signs of Rikidōzan having any actual links to the North Korean government, and he was reportedly investing into the development of a new country club in Tokyo. Not exactly the behavior of someone who was getting ready to leave the country to move to North Korea. Officially, the murder was concluded to be the result of the ongoing turf war between the Sumiyoshi-kai and Machihisa Yuki's Tosei-kai. Rikidōzan's funeral took place on December 20th, 1963 at Tokyo's Ikegami Honmonji Temple. Around 12,000 people are said to have attended the funeral, paying their respects to the man who helped Japan regain its confidence after the war. The name Kim Sin-Rak, however, is notably absent from his gravestone, which, as Robert Whiting perfectly put it, stood as a lasting reminder of the layers of deception that were helping to build the foundation for the new Japan. Until his tragic death, Rikidōzan never got to reveal his true identity to the Japanese public. Some of his business partners, including Kodama Yoshio, thought that if the wrestler revealed to the public where he came from, he would lose at least 50% of his fanbase. Patriotic Japanese fans who would never accept a Korean as their hero. The Koreans themselves, however, seemingly felt that Japan's national hero was also one of them. In spite of how fresh the wounds of Japan's brutal occupation still were, Rikidōzan received a hero's welcome from the Korean citizens during a visit to Seoul, with newspapers featuring headlines like, "He's become Japanese, but his blood hasn't changed." Long after he had passed away, in the mid-90s especially, the North Korean government seemingly developed an increased interest in Rikidōzan and tried their best to promote him as one of their own, for propaganda purposes. In that sense, Rikidōzan managed to become the hero of more than just one country. For the Japanese, he was the man from the land of the rising sun who beat the evil gaijins silly. For the people of Korea, he was the guy who made it big in a country where prejudice and discrimination against Koreans is unfortunately all too common. The legacy of Rikidōzan is truly a double-edged sword, because for all his faults as a person, and for all the people that he insulted and hurt along the way, there were a few million others that he inspired and gave hope to, when he needed it most. What do you think about the story of Rikidōzan? Let me know in the comments down below. Also, as usual, I want to give a huge shout out to all my Patreon supporters listed here, including Busner, Bobby Vu, Javier Soravia, Capybara Chuck, Turam, White Gilden, Justin Down, and Yoko the Space Whale. And to everyone who made it all the way to the end, as always, thank you so much for watching. Sayonara.